Let me just start the recording here. Here we go. And essentially, a few things before we dive in. I will be sending out the deck of this presentation to everybody who registered after the presentation. It'll also be available on our website. And actually, for everyone who's currently viewing the webinar, you can also click on the handouts, and it is currently available to you through the GoToWebinar system that you're viewing the presentation with at this moment. Our next webinar will be on the 24th. It'll be on funding opportunities for clinical stage research. And I'll be adding a link to register to that into the chat as well. So you can just click on that and you'll have it available to register for our webinar. Any questions that you may have that will come up during the talk, please add them into the questions section and I'll try to address as many of them as possible towards the end. Any questions that I don't get to, I will try to answer directly by email. So let's dive in. Non-dilutive funding opportunities for cancer R&D. So first, a few words about who we are and what we do. We've been around for almost 20 years now, running on 70 full-time employees. We work across the life sciences, academic institutes, medical research centers, and throughout the industry, all the way up from tiny seed stage startups, all the way up to some of the largest players in the field. We submit 500, even 550 applications a year on behalf of our clients. And so we have amassed a fairly significant amount of knowledge and expertise in this specific space. And we really view ourselves as a tool that can be used to maximizing your potential for this type of funding. We do that basically through identifying the most relevant sources of funding, help you strategize per application and maximize the chances of each one of those applications eventually being awarded. We manage any complex project management processes, multifaceted, multi-pronged applications, things like that. We lead the joint application writing, of course, as well, and also support, when relevant, final contract negotiations with the funding agency in situations such as research contracts and things like that. In general, we advocate using non-dilutive funding as a strategic financial tool, and it definitely can be that when treated correctly and used correctly, maybe. In general, currently the NIH budget stands at about $34 billion, wherein the vast majority of that, almost 28, is currently available for extramural research, meaning actually going out to fund external research and not staying within the NIH. And actually, as many of you may be aware, very recently, towards the end of March, the budget was actually increased from $34 to $37 billion. Although there were a lot of predictions initially when Trump came into power that a lot of budgets may be cut, so far we're seeing the exact opposite, which is obviously very reassuring. Specifically, when we kind of focus in on the specifics, oncology space and on the NCI within the NIH specifically, we can see a very significant increase in the budget over the last few years. That, I don't know if it's going to continue quite as drastically as it has been since 2015, but regardless, this is a field of research that has a lot of focus. There was, in 2016, there was the moonshot with Biden, as you probably recall. This recent increase is also, a significant portion of it is expected to go to the NCI. So it's a space wherein there truly is a very significant amount of funding from the government and in general non-dilutive funding. That money is actually going really across any indication in the oncology field. Obviously, you know, the big killers and the most common ones are receiving more funds than others. But there really is, if you look at this graph kind of in terms of where this year the funds are estimated to be going, obviously I couldn't add all the different indications within the oncology space, but if you kind of envision the way the full graph looks, there is an extremely long tail on this, and because the money really is going across the space to pretty much any indication. And you'll see within a lot of the different funding mechanisms that we discussed today, very rarely, if at all, are they indication specific. So if you have something that's relevant for something that's not necessarily one of the big ones, it could still be very interesting, obviously depending on the specifics of the project. In terms of the actual submission routes, there are basically two types of funding mechanisms within the agencies that are relevant in the oncology space, solicited and unsolicited. Solicited mechanisms, and we'll be discussing quite a few of them, they're essentially mechanisms that kind of give you, it's a solicitation that lists exactly what they're looking for. They'll say, a specific type of research, a specific stage of development, etc. And if that is a good fit for what the activities that you are looking to fund are, then you should definitely utilize that type of mechanism. But in oncology over the last few years, and I'll dive into in a second into how and if that may be changing currently, but in general, at least until now, a very significant portion of the funds has been going out through unsolicited mechanisms, which is essentially our investigator initiated, meaning there's no specific kind of categories of what the project should be, what it should look like, specific indications, specific types of approach. It really is completely open. It has to be interesting if you're submitting to the NCI, as an example. Obviously, it has to be interesting to the NCI and relevant to their mission, meaning probably oncology-centric in this case. But there's no specific type of research that is something that has to be submitted. And actually, up until 2017, over half of the awards every year, usually between 60 and 70% of the awards, went out through these unsolicited mechanisms. Currently, and a big part of the reason we're having this discussion today is the fact that the NCI really did kind of an overhaul and revamped the various funding mechanisms that they have this year. So it's currently a bit early to estimate how this will change, because in the past, there were not a huge amount of specific funding mechanisms from the NCI, and a lot of it went through the open kind of investigator-initiated mechanisms. They currently, early this year, issued a pretty significant amount of specific calls. So we don't anticipate that number to stay at about 2/3 of the awards. That being said, we do anticipate a significant portion of funds to still be available through the unsolicited mechanism. So I guess the take-home message from this slide and in general for this point of discussion is that even if you go through everything that we discussed today and you don't really see anything that's a good fit, so first of all, I'm not going through nearly all of the specific calls, and it's definitely recommended that you go and search on your own if you haven't seen anything that's relevant or specific. But even if there really is nothing that is a specific call that's tailored to what you do, it should not discourage you in any way, shape, or form. A very significant portion of the funds, even if it's not staying between 60 and 70%, still a very significant portion of the funds will be going out through the investigator-initiated, unsolicited mechanisms. So if they like your ideas, even if they're not a perfect fit for a call that's out there, you have a very significant chance of receiving funds. And moving into kind of a quick overview on, first of all, of the unsolicited opportunities that are out there, starting with the NIH. And the NIH is the major funder in the field in general, and also that uses the unsolicited mechanisms. So this is basically the omnibus SBIR. And this is your standard SBIR. Phase 1 is up to 225,000. Phase 2 is 1.5 million. And it's basically any small business, U.S. small business that is recognized by the SBA as a small business is eligible. It's a bit more business oriented than many of the other grants, but it's a good source of funding. It's not a huge dollar amount, but 1.5 million is definitely nothing to shake a stick at for a phase 2. And in general, these mechanisms do have a STTR counterpart, which is basically for technology transfer from an academic institute, kind of a collaboration between an academic institute and a for-profit entity. And if that is the situation where it's really being spun out and part of the work is still being done in the academic institute, that mechanism may be a better fit, but they're very, very similar. The next deadline for both is early September, September 5th, and this could be a good fit for various different things. The next funding mechanism we're going to discuss is, one second here. Yeah, so the next funding mechanism we're going to discuss is a SBIR mechanism that is specifically for clinical trials. Now, clearly, the dollar amount here will not cover most clinical trials, but it's definitely something that can be added to fund a clinical trial or a very small clinical trial, something very exploratory. And essentially, the phase 1 here and the phase 2 are the same dollar amounts, but, and this is an important point, the budget cap can be exceeded on a specific list of topics, and this is authorization from the SBA, because actually the budget cap on SBIRs does not come from the funder. The budget cap is defined by law and from the SBA. Now, the SBA basically lists a set of topics where the budget can be waived. Specifically for clinical trials, it's most relevant, although it honestly can be done in other spaces as well. But in this case, in the oncology space, and the link is something that I added here to the slide itself, it's pretty much everything. Anything in the oncology space. One of the topics is literally the word therapeutics. Another one is imaging. So it really, essentially, you have to contact them in advance to do this, but it covers really everything in the space. Diagnostics, imaging, therapeutics, anything you can think of is probably within the list of topics that you can get a budget waiver for. Now, they have to like the project. They won't waive the budget cap on anything, but you should treat the budget cap here as a very soft cap because almost any project in the space qualifies at least to apply for a budget waiver. So this is also a funding mechanism that's good, and this is something that you should probably use if you're submitting an SBIR for a clinical trial. If it's preclinical work, then you should use the previous mechanism that I discussed. The deadline here is exactly the same, September 5th, and this also has a STTR counterpart, wherein if it's something that's being spun out of a university and it's a collaboration in the same way discussed previously, then you should use the STTR, not the SBIR. This is the major mechanism that is used, the major non-SBIR mechanism that is used to fund up to this date until the revamp. This is the mechanism that really was used for the vast majority of those 65%, 60 to 70 most years, 65% last year. This is basically a mechanism that has no specific requirements in terms of what the science should be. And this is not an SBIR, so everybody's eligible. And this is true, honestly, for organizations that are non-US organizations. Anybody can submit this. You submit your application, and if they like the science, you have a chance of being awarded. There's no official budget cap, although we definitely recommend making sure, A, that your request reflects the actual needs, and B, discuss it in advance to make sure it's realistic. If you're trying to fund, a project and you're asking for $20 million here, it's not technically more than you're allowed to submit for, but will you be awarded? Probably not. So you should make sure it is within scope by discussing with them. Now moving into some of the specifically solicited opportunities. We'll start with some of the smaller ones. First of all, there is a general kind of omnibus parent R21, which is similar to the one I just discussed, but smaller in scope for very early exploratory research. But the NCI does not participate in that. So actually, the general NIH investigator-initiated mechanism for smaller and earlier stage projects is not something you can submit in the oncology space. The NCI have their own mechanism, which is this mechanism. So it's not technically unsolicited. It is a solicitation, but it's completely open in terms of scope. It's a solicitation from the NCI, wherein they accept anything that's relevant to their mission. So de facto, it functions as an unsolicited mechanism, even though it's a solicitation. And this is for, as I mentioned, earlier stage exploratory work, much more small and defined projects. It's up to about, including the indirect cost, it'll probably go up to, depending on the rate, but usually slightly over 300,000, spread over up to 2 years. The next deadline is around the corner. It's June 19th. This can be, something that, because it's a smaller dollar amount, it's a smaller investment on their part, they're definitely willing to take more risks with this type of mechanism. So if you have something that could be a real breakthrough, but it's not something that you have a lot of substantiated claims about, and it's just a really, really good idea that you're excited about, this may be a fantastic mechanism to use. Have a few mechanisms. This is one of the two that I choose to discuss, innovative molecular and cellular analysis technologies for basic and clinical cancer research. This is an R21, so the same budget cap, although non-standard deadlines here, so the next deadline is right around the corner, May 29th. And then following that, because it's very, very soon, I decided to add the deadline following that as well. September 28th will be the next deadline after May 29th. And this is for novel technologies, obviously in the field of molecular and cellular analysis, and obviously cancer. And this is for early stage feasibility studies. As soon as you've gone beyond that point, this is the mechanism that you should use. And this is kind of the second phase of that mechanism, and it actually says R21 here as well, but that's my mistake. It should be R33, and I will correct that before I send out the slides. Let me just make a note of that. Okay, I will make sure to correct that before I send out the slides. So the slides that you will receive will have the correct name of the mechanism in it. But regardless, if you're looking through Google for this solicitation, the RFA CA 18003 is accurate. So you'll find the right one regardless. Now, the budget cap here is almost $1 million, with the indirect cost usually over $1 million. And this is, in terms of the scope of what it will cover, it's fairly identical, although this is for more advanced development and validation, and not kind of what we were discussing earlier, which is, as we mentioned, was early stage feasibility. So both of these together cover a fairly wide range in the specific field of molecular and cellular analysis technologies. Same deadlines here, May 29th, and then following that, September 28th. This is a mechanism that focuses, and we'll touch on a few that are in kind of the diagnostics and imaging areas initially. This one is for academic industrial partnerships, and there are not a lot of guidelines here. So basically, almost any type of collaboration will qualify here, and you should make sure it's a fit for your specific type of partnership. But in general, this is not like an STTR where there's specific requirements on specific percentages of the work that need to be carried out on each end. It's significantly less specific in its demands. There's no budget cap here, but again, make sure you're asking for something realistic, A, in terms of historically what they've been interested in funding, and B, what is an actual reflection of what you're proposing to carry out. And in this case, it's engineering developments in imaging or spectroscopic technologies, and essentially anything in this field that is something that you're looking to fund, and you have that type of a partnership. This is a very good mechanism to use. We've had quite a few successes with this mechanism, and it's a very good mechanism to use obviously when it's a good fit. And this is a similar mechanism in terms of the fact that it's also looking for the same types of partnerships, but this is for translation and validation in vivo cancer imaging systems. And basically, if this is the space that you're engaged in, they're looking for collaborations between life science and physical sciences, and kind of applying a multidisciplinary bioengineering approach. And this one and the previous one are also from not just the NCI, but the NIBIB, which is the National Institute of Bioimaging and Bioengineering. They participate in this, and basically anything that has aspects, that are more either kind of the physics aspects of obviously of imaging, or even in diagnostics, obviously kind of the detection has a lot of, really depending on the method, but there could be a lot of physics involved as well. So these are the areas that they're interested in. And these are two specific solicitations that both of them have no budget cap. Both of them historically are funding low single digit millions if you're looking at what's realistic to ask, and the same deadline, June 5th. Another funding mechanism from the same institutes, the NCI and the NIBIB, has a similar focus in terms of life sciences and physical sciences, bioengineering, things like that. And this is just more broad in the sense that it's not specifically for neither the initial example of technologies for diagnosis and treatment, nor is it specifically for cancer imaging systems. This is for anything else. So if you have a therapeutic device or various different possibilities that are fit for the general approach they're looking for, but not a fit for one of these previous two mechanisms, this would probably be the mechanism to use. This mechanism does have a budget cap of about 2.5 million before the indirect, so usually over 3 million. And it's very similar. If you have something that is a much more defined project, and usually also initial, not necessarily defined. This project should be defined as well, obviously, but I guess a smaller scope of research and usually earlier stage work. There is also a R21 equivalent of this funding mechanism. It's also open in terms of the scope, and the number for that in call for applications is here at the bottom. It's PA 18286, so you easily be able to find that as well. And in that case, as is with most R21s, you'll have a budget of just over 300,000 with the indirect costs. The next deadline for the R21 is June 16th, and the next deadline for the R01, the larger one, is June 5th. This is specifically for image-guided drug delivery, and these are all kind of very focused in the space, and we'll be discussing other spaces as well. But in this case, it supports real-time image guidance, monitoring, quantitative in vivo characterizations, validation of delivery and response, and in general, they want to support development of integrated imaging-based systems, quantitative imaging assays of drug delivery, and early intervention with those systems. This does not have a budget cap, but obviously you have to justify what you ask for. And here it's a bit more difficult to say historically what they've funded because it's a very, very new mechanism. But we anticipate similar caps, not in terms of a formal cap, but in terms of what is realistic to ask for. So probably a few million and no more than that. The NCI also has specific funding mechanisms now for clinical trials, and this is also all very, very new. Historically, the NCI has not always been easy to tap for funding for clinical trials, and that's changed. During 2017, they released a lot of notices saying that they had an intention to move into funding more clinical trials. And early this year, we started to see the results of that, and there are a few funding mechanisms that came out. I'll discuss two of them, but there are a couple others as well. These are the main ones that I think would be most relevant for the vast majority of people attending the webinar today. But again, go through the NCI website and you'll find a list of everything. This is the NCI's investigator-initiated early phase clinical trials for cancer treatment and diagnosis. And this is a mechanism only for clinical trials. You probably saw with previous mechanisms that there were cases where it says clinical trial not allowed, and sometimes it said clinical trial optional. But this is the first time we see clinical trial required. And that means the only applicants here will be other clinical trials. When you see a mechanism with clinical trial optional, in many cases, it'll be kind of either the end of the preclinical development and some of the phase one, or maybe all of phase one, but it's usually kind of that gap. Here, you can fund a phase one, you can even fund a phase two with this funding mechanism. It's not intended on funding late stage clinical trials, but honestly, when you're conducting a phase three clinical trial in oncology, a few $1 million from a grant is really not what you're looking for anyway, to be fair. Now, this has a deadline, again, coming up June 5th. And I would advise you to contact the NCI post-haste if you intend on submitting this, because funding for clinical trials is something you should discuss in advance with them, and they should know about who you are and what you're doing and what you're going to submit, and have a discussion with them. We usually suggest at least 8 weeks in advance. I think officially they ask for you to contact them with clinical trials no less than 6 weeks in advance. So it's not that far in the future regardless, but I wouldn't waste any time, and I'd go ahead and contact them immediately if this is something you're considering to do. This is completely open in terms of the type of trial. So it basically, as you can see here, clinical trials focus on cancer-targeted diagnostic and therapeutic interventions, which, you know, I could be challenged on this point, but I'll go ahead and say it covers pretty much everything. And if not, then there are other funding mechanisms specifically for things that this doesn't cover. One of those is specifically for imaging and image-guided interventions. Now, technically, that would be covered in the other one, but because this is more specific, if this budget, which is lower, it's only $500,000, but if this is something that is a good fit, because it's more specific, typically that means if it's a good fit for you, your chances of success will be a bit higher. So if this is a good fit for what you're looking to fund, and $500,000 is, you know, something that will be helpful for that, because obviously for many clinical trials, $500,000 is not even worth putting ink to paper, to be completely honest. But if this is kind of a very early phase clinical trial, validation, and first in man, then you're really trying to make sure that your imaging or image-guided intervention works, and the $500,000 is something you could, excuse me, really use. It's a great mechanism. June 28th, it's a very new mechanism, and although there are no official success rates published because there have not been any awardees yet in this mechanism, as I mentioned, it's new. We anticipate that this may be a mechanism with fairly good success rates for the oncology space. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into all of the oncology relevant opportunities from the NIH or from the NCI, specifically in the NIBIB, which we discussed as well. But I did want to list a few of the ones that I think are maybe not quite as widely applicable as the ones we discussed here, but also definitely could be relevant. So there are a few here, and then a few on this next slide. And as I mentioned, I will be sending out all of the slides so that you can have them. In the handouts now, you can download this version with the mistake I mentioned earlier on slide 16, but it's a very minor mistake, so it should be fine as well. And it's also going to be available on our website, and I'm repeating myself now. So moving forward, the NSF also funds projects in the oncology space. We're talking about fairly small awards, $225 for their phase one, $750,000 for their phase two. And it's specifically kind of nanotechnology, advanced materials, diagnostics, things like that, drug delivery, platform development, that kind of slightly more technology-oriented projects that are a good fit for what the NSF does. The next deadline is June 14th. So if that's aligned with what you do, it's definitely something you could do. And by the way, submitting an NSF SBAR is something that you can do concurrently with submitting other applications, because it's a different funder. You can actually send the exact same activities you're sending here to the NSF and also to the NIH and also to the DoD, because they're different funders. You can multiplex your applications in that way, and that's something that we do typically try to do as much as possible with our clients. I just mentioned the Department of Defense, and we'll be diving into a couple of their open solicitations at the moment. In general, the most relevant funding mechanism from the Department of Defense in the oncology space is the CDMRPs, the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs. These are a set of programs that basically this is money that's appropriated by Congress every year. Last year was about just over $1 billion. Various different types of awards. Each program will have different funding mechanisms within it. And typically the oncology relevant programs, and to be fair, most of the 2018 CDMPs have yet to be issued. Usually they're issued around this time or later in April. Last year they were a bit late. This year we don't expect them to be late. But generally the ones that are recurring programs are the breast cancer research program, which has already been issued for this year, and we'll be looking at that in a bit more depth in a second. The lung cancer research program, the ovarian cancer research program, the prostate cancer research program, and the peer-reviewed cancer research program, which is a much more broad program, and it covers various different indications, and I'll touch on that in a second as well. In general, the CDMRPs work a bit differently. Everything we've discussed to date had a specific deadline. You submit an application on that deadline, it's reviewed, and hopefully you're awarded. The CDMRPs work differently. Initially, there will be a deadline, but you'll submit a pre-application, which is not a huge document. The quad chart and the white paper together, everything included will usually be less than 5 pages. Sometimes as little as 2 or 3. Rarely will it exceed 5, and even in those cases, we're talking about a 6, 7, 8 page package. It's really not a very hefty document. That being said, this is the major cutoff. So although it's not a huge amount of work, it is very important to do this as well as possible because most applications do not progress beyond the pre-application and are not asked to submit the full application. Hopefully your pre-application is favorably reviewed. You get asked to submit a full application. Usually it'll take about 2 to 3 months for that to happen, although your experience may vary. And basically, once you get the notice that you're asked to submit a full application, you'll usually have anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks to submit the full application. So you really have to hit the ground running. That's reviewed, and hopefully you'll be awarded. The one program that has already been issued for 2018, excuse me, is the breast cancer research program. And basically, the Breakthrough Award has 4 levels of funding. Levels 1 and 2 have budget caps of $600,000 and $1 million respectively. And the level 1 is for really innovative, high-risk, high-reward research. Really the earliest stages of development. They say they don't require preliminary data, although we highly recommend adding preliminary data. And it's really for proof of concept. Level 2 would be research that's already supported by preliminary data and has potential to make significant advancements, meaning, honestly, almost anything can be a level 2, as long as you have a little bit of data to validate your claims, although sometimes based on our experience, we will choose to submit a level 1 if there's not enough preliminary data. So it really, it should be viewed on a case-to-case basis, but generally speaking, those are the differences between the level 1 and level 2 awards. Something interesting about specifically about the breast cancer level 1 and 2 awards, and I know I just mentioned that the pre-application is very competitive and it's the major cutoff. And this is true across the board with all CDMRPs in oncology and in all of the other areas of research that the CDMRPs cover. All that being said, the only programs in which that is not true at all are specifically these 2 that we're discussing right now. Actually, the level 1 and level 2 breast research program pre-applications are a formality. Everybody is invited to submit a full application, and you'll see that represented in the deadlines, wherein the deadline for the pre-application is May 16th and the full application is May 30th. So they don't expect to review all the pre-applications, make a decision, and then get back to you and you'll write an application by May 30th. Obviously, that's not realistic. Basically, it's more of a letter of intent in this case, and it's formatted differently. It's formatted as a pre-application, but essentially it functions as a letter of intent. It's not a competitive phase in this case. Excuse me. There we go. So, on the other hand, the the level 3 and level 4 breakthrough awards function as your standard CDMRP, as I mentioned earlier, where the pre-application is not only competitive, it's actually very competitive, and the budget caps are up to up to 4 million for a level 3 or 10 million for a level 4 in terms of determining where you're positioned. So level 3 is for advanced translational studies that have potential for near-term clinical investigation. Small-scale clinical trials may apply here as well. So it's really kind of moving towards the clinic or very, very early clinic. And then level 4 is for large-scale projects and really either near-term clinical impact or in general, excuse me, something that's completely clinical. Human clinical testing is absolutely required here. And obviously, as something that is completely clinical, PIs are expected to have experience in successfully leading large-scale projects. And that's obviously something that, even if it wasn't a formal requirement, it's something you should definitely do when you're submitting an application for a large-scale clinical trial. Here, the pre-application is also mid-May, but the full application, because this is a competitive pre-application, obviously is not 2 weeks later, and the full application here is August 14th. As I mentioned earlier, the rest of the oncology CDMRPs have yet to be issued for this year. We have had 3 pre-announcements so far come out for the prostate cancer research program, the lung cancer research program, and the peer-reviewed cancer research program. But not the final announcements with the deadlines and all of that. To give you some insight on what the peer-reviewed cancer research programs will cover this year, every year they issue a list of specific indications. So as I mentioned, this is a much broader program. And this is the list they've issued. They also clarified that this is not the final list, and they reserve the right to change this. Usually any changes that are made at this point would be because of sudden changes to the budget that is appropriated. But that aside, typically what's issued in the pre-announcement is typically withheld and stands true for the actual announcements. So it's bladder cancer, brain cancer, pediatric cancer, actually even here in adolescents and young adults. And if I remember correctly, the way they define that is up to the age of 39 in terms of young adults. Colorectal, anything that's immunotherapy, so that's obviously very wide and very, very current. Listeria-based regimens for cancer, liver cancer, lymphoma, melanoma, and other skin cancers, mesothelioma, myeloma, neuroblastoma, pancreatic cancer, pediatric brain tumors, and stomach cancer. All of those will be covered by the PRCRP. And stay tuned, because these are expected to be issued very soon. That basically will conclude the overview of the different funding opportunities that are currently available. The main focus here was the fact that there was that overhaul with the NIH that I mentioned, and that moving forward, it seems like there will be much more focus on clinical activities and in general on specific solicitations from the NCI. They really made a kind of overhaul of everything of their funding mechanisms. You can see in the numbers of the calls for funding that we discussed, a very significant portion of them had, after the PA or the PAR, the number 18, which means that almost all of them were issued in the last 2 or 3 months. So everything here is all very new opportunities. In terms of how that is reviewed, and also obviously the DoD that I mentioned, and the CDMRPs are a fantastic source of funding, and definitely nothing that should be neglected if you're in the oncology space. And it's a bit less known, but the CDMRPs are really a fantastic source of funding. But going back to the review process, and this is taken from the NIH website, and this is how the specific NIH review criteria work. But the truth is, this holds true pretty much for any funder. The question: do you have the right leadership? Do you have the right environment? Do you have the right? Is it significant? Is it innovative? The answer to all of these questions must obviously be yes. But what eventually will determine the fate of an application, not even 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100 will be a top-notch scientific approach. And the review process is really a risk management process. They're weighing the risks against the strengths, meaning you should also know to address the fact that there are possible pitfalls and there are risks, but you're aware of them and you know how to address them and minimize them. And obviously also convey the strengths and the importance and the significance and how you're meeting unmet medical needs that are of real importance. And basically by doing this for each one of your projects and using as many sources of funding and multiplexing, as I mentioned earlier, this is the approach we take to truly take non-dilutive funding and make it a strategic source of funding for companies. Yes, historically VCs, public markets, angels, private investors, all of those things are treated as the usual sources of funding for companies, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely true. But we definitely advocate and believe that while being true, neglecting non-dilutive funding while doing so can in many cases really be a mistake. We think it's an important part of a portfolio, or rather of kind of the landscape of bringing in funds to any company. At least any company that's engaged in research, obviously. And we view ourselves as a tool for you to truly maximize your chances of receiving the awards. We take a systematic approach, as I mentioned earlier, conducting a thorough strategic assessment, identifying all of the relevant funding opportunities for anything that you're looking to fund. We look at the specific interests and trends within the funding agencies, within the funding mechanisms, make sure we correlate between what you are submitting and what they're actually looking for them at the moment, also correlating between the strategy on a higher level and your research plan. I always say, the fact that there's an opportunity that you could address doesn't mean that if that's not something you want to do as a company and it doesn't fit into your strategy, it's not necessarily the right thing to do, even if you could technically submit an application for it. But obviously, all the decisions at the end of the day would be yours. It's important to target the right mechanism, kind of attacking different pockets of money and really maximizing your chances of award by approaching all of the relevant sources and not focusing on the more common ones. And finally, the right stage of development will relate with different sizes of awards, different success rates, as I mentioned earlier. And it's really approaching the right sources and kind of creating a strategy and basically creating a long-term multi-submission granting strategy is at the end of the day what makes this type of funding something that can be treated as a true strategic source of funding and less as a kind of one-off gamble. It's important, as I mentioned earlier, based on the review, the way it's reviewed and recognizing the fact that it is kind of a process where they weigh the risks against the advantages. It's important to try to lower the risk, and this is something we help you do by understanding your weaknesses, finding the right partners when necessary, that can kind of offset and complement the skill sets that you have in-house. Understanding obviously the mechanism and priorities and interests will definitely do that as well. And basically kind of position yourself well in terms of where you're coming from, what you're submitting. I've already gone through this, basically kind of the multi-pronged strategy of identifying everything, creating a strategy, and moving forward and submitting as many of the applications as possible. This is really the way to do it. And that pretty much covers what I wanted to discuss today. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions that you have not typed into the question section, feel free to do so now. and I will address as many of them as I can. At least I'll try to address the ones that are kind of general in scope and not something that's extremely specific. If it's specific for your organization and not necessarily something that I think everybody else can benefit from, I'll probably choose to answer you by email. So there's one question here about non-US applicants. So essentially, first of all, the question is can I apply as a non-US entity? Yes, there are funding mechanisms that I mentioned that are not open to non-US applicants, specifically SBARs and STTRs, wherever they were throughout the presentation. But other than that, the vast majority of the mechanisms are open. If you look at a specific call and kind of go into the actual solicitation, just do Control F and write non-US, and immediately it will jump to whether or not non-US applicants may apply. But as a blanket statement, almost everything we discussed here today that was not an SBAR or an STTR is absolutely open to non-US applicants. Okay. There was a specific question about, is this for a clinical trial? Well, I'm not sure exactly what slide I was on when that was asked, so I apologize. But anything that was defined as something that would cover a clinical trial obviously is for actual clinical testing. And anything that said clinical trial optional would mean that they're open to funding clinical activities, probably in most cases where you would find the sweet spot for that type of mechanism would be early clinical if you're adding clinical activities to that application, but still it is open to doing that. There's a question here about the indirect costs that I kept mentioning. So basically, the way it works is there are a few components to any award, depending on the funding mechanism, either direct, indirect, and a profit or a fee. And the terminology varies. Sometimes the indirect is called overhead. But regardless, it's basically a percentage of the award that's awarded on top of the actual direct cost of research. So let's say the cost of research in the budget is $1 million. So typically you're talking about anything between 20 and 30% on top of that. So technically, if you're submitting an application with a $1 million budget for the actual scientific activities, the award at the end of the day will be anywhere between 1.2 and 1.3 million dollars, and that's because of the indirect costs. Are there any specific funding for biologics for oncology? Only for specifically for biologics. I'm not aware of something that's a call only for biologics. There are a lot of different mechanisms that are open to funding biologics in oncology. Kind of a platform. I see you said a platform. This is something that I'd rather discuss with the. I'll shoot you an email, and maybe we could discuss this, because this is very specific. It really depends on the specifics. In general, the NIBIB is open to funding platform technologies, but again, it really depends on the specifics of a project. So and again, I appreciate your questions, but I think if something is very, very specific, I think it'd be more beneficial to discuss it in person, or at least over the phone, probably not in person, or via email. I think in terms of the very broad questions, that does cover it. So I think I'll end the webinar here. As I mentioned, I will reach out by email to anybody who asked a question that I did not address. Please remember to if you're interested, attend our webinar on the 24th. That would be for funding opportunities for clinical stage research across the board in terms of the different scientific areas, but the focus will be on all clinical funding opportunities. And in general, I look forward to speaking again soon in upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining today, and I hope you enjoyed it.